Hey there, and welcome back to another episode of the Relationship School's Smart Couple Podcast, where we help you have safe, sexy, and successful long-term relationships, while at the same time learning about your family relationships, work relationships, friendships, and improving and enhancing those, and probably cutting out of your life people who hold you back and are wanting you to be a certain strategy of an old version of yourself, when really there's a new you emerging. So I'll probably do an episode on that at some point, is letting go of people. What's up in this episode, guys? I have got exciting news here. I definitely am pumped to share this interview with you, especially for people in the therapeutic community. I, as you know, tend to bridge many different worlds, from the coaching world to the psychotherapy world, the brain science world, my own experience, and many other worlds as a way to help you understand yourself in the context of partnership better. Because I think your self-awareness is the key to, one of the keys, we'll say that, to a really fulfilling partnership over time. So in this episode, I've got Bessel van der Kolk, and he wrote The Body Keeps Score, which is this incredibly intricate look at trauma in the human experience. And he, in that book, interviews, the guy has been a psychiatrist for 44 years, and he has seen probably the most horrific and sat with the most horrific experiences that the human person goes through, from incest to rape to murder, molestation, veterans of war, traumatized children who've been neglected and abandoned and hit and sexually assaulted and molested. You name it, the guy has probably seen it. And so he's just been in the trenches, working hard to help humanity, especially around this conversation around trauma and why it matters so much to well-being in life and fulfillment. And also, he's an MD and a psychiatrist, and he's gone beyond the standard medical model, which basically suggests that you label people and then you treat them with medication, which is traditional psychiatry, is find a diagnosis like OCD, ADHD, bipolar disorder, depressive disorder, borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, which I learned in grad school, by the way, this 545-page book, how to diagnose people. Now, I didn't have the deep understanding that a psychiatrist does because I wasn't allowed to give out medication. But I did have to diagnose people, and it just went against everything inside my body. I was like, I can't do this. Like, this is bullshit to label people like this. That's where I was at the time. I see that it has a place at times. Largely, though, I'm not a big fan. And so here's someone like Bessel who comes along and challenges the system and tries to, he actually was involved in the first ESM, and he'll share about that in this episode, what was useful about that, but where it's gone since then. And he's tried really hard to get childhood developmental trauma in the DSM, and the American Psychiatric Association refuses to accept that as valid or legitimate. He even has a statement from them in his book about why they think it's not valid, and even though it's backed by research and studies, rigorous studies. So he's also a researcher, and he's done countless studies with people to try to help again, move this conversation forward, to get people like you and me who've had, let's say, childhood trauma, the healing and that they need, rather than doling out medications, which keeps us actually from our journey, even though it can stabilize us in the short term. So let me read you a little more about him. Now, if you've heard about Bessel, he's been in the news. There was a controversial article, I think the original one was from the Boston Globe, that said, allegations of employee mistreatment, Royal Renowned Brookline Trauma Center. It's got this big picture of him, and it's a pretty long, lengthy look at all these allegations that he was basically an asshole and treated people really poorly in his years there. And since then, he's written a response on his website. And I suggest, if you're interested at all, if you're a therapist and you study this guy at all, I suggest you go read that if you haven't already. You probably have. And it's just his response back. saying, this is a character assassination and so on and so forth. Before we started the interview, I said, hey man, let's talk about the obvious. Is it okay that I bring this up, or do you want to keep this off the table? He's like, no, absolutely, bring it up. Let's talk about it because it's in the space. And I was like, God, that's so sweet. Thank you. So we spent just a few minutes on it. I didn't want to make the whole interview some kind of interrogation or just my own curiosity following, and then what happened, and then that, because that's the kind of person I am. I could just drill down into this whole news fiasco for him in this article and really try to understand his perspective. I could have spent 2 hours doing that. But I also was thinking of you, the listener, and wanted to make sure that you got some goods around trauma for yourself, or if you're a therapist or coach, that you get a couple of frames on trauma that might help you in your work with people. Okay, so Bessel van der Kolk is a clinical psychiatrist whose work integrates the mind, brain, and body and social connections to understand and treat trauma. His research ranges from the impact of trauma and developmental and brain imaging to the use of yoga, neurofeedback, EMDR, and theater for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. And Bessel is a professor of psychiatry at Boston University School of Medicine and a medical director of the Trauma Center at Boston, which again, now that's all changing. He'll talk about that a little bit. Bessel is the author of more than 150 peer-reviewed scientific articles and several books, including the New York Times bestseller, The Body Keeps Score, which I have read and is amazing. I'm almost done with it. So he's friends with Pat Ogden and a lot of these people that I've interviewed, Stephen Porges, Dan Siegel, all these folks out there cite Bessel van der Kolk when they're citing trauma. If in that circle, Bessel van der Kolk is one of the bigger names who has just moved so much forward by way of trying to help people with trauma. So I'm just psyched that there's people like this out there. Whatever he did or didn't do, you can't deny the fact that he helped countless people deal with trauma and help the medical establishment find better solutions to help young children and adults who struggle with PTSD and any kind of trauma-related challenges or stressors in their life. So I have big respect for this guy. Outside of any kind of allegations of anything, it's like he's made his mark on the planet in such a big way. So I'm eager to share this with some of you for sort of other folks that might not get trauma or might not have this sort of psychology mind. This interview might not be as interesting for you. So just giving you a heads up. And as always, stay tuned to the end for your action step. Here we go. All right, welcome to the show, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk.
Hi, nice to be here.
Hi. Yeah, it's excellent to have you here. I was just showing you that I've been devouring this book here, and it's just helping me a ton in terms of understanding trauma. I was trained at a 3-year master's degree program, and we didn't really touch on trauma a whole lot. So I had to go get external training in a Gestalt modality that worked with trauma. And then I had an internship at a family mental health center that every person that came in was dealing with massive amounts of trauma, and I felt totally inadequate to help them. So when I read your book,
it's interesting that, I think trauma is probably the main thing that people come into mental health centers with, and somehow the professionals have been able to dissociate it off. It's an astounding phenomenon, actually.
Yeah, it really is. So Bessel, I wanted to just start with just the obvious here, which is you've been in the news. There was this controversy, and I've read up on it, and I just wanted to get to hear from the cat's mouth, so to speak, of what the heck's going on here.
Well,
and
it's a terrible thing that happened, and the news reported it wrongly. It said I was fired by the trauma center. No, I was fired by JRI, which was our administrative arm. And what happened is that our executive director of the trauma center, very important person in the trauma center, was fired for cause in November. And I think that the CEO of JRI was embarrassed about the fact that he let something go on way too long. And what he told my staff is he was trying to mitigate a liability, or term I don't quite understand. And then he put the responsibility on me and fired me on the spot without any investigation on nonsense allegations, the entire trauma center staff unanimously and vociferously objected to these false allegations. And in fact, the staff pretty unanimously is working with me on starting a new trauma center, which is not exactly something I would have liked to have done at this age. But the trauma center, as we established it, has been destroyed by these nonsense allegations. And of course, my reputation is questioned by people. I can't blame them after reading that report. But nobody's ever taken out a complaint against me. What was in the report we got from GRI are really nonsense allegations. I've told people that they fucked up at one point. Well, we say that to people sometimes over a 15-year period, once or twice. But there was really nothing there to justify it. And what's actually has happened is by this hostile takeover, they took all of my research funding. They took all of the endowment money that supporters have sent to us. And basically, we're up against the wall of JRI having stolen our money. So we're in a lawsuit to really reclaim our funding and to also in a defamation lawsuit because it's really quite awful.
Yeah. Now, the allegations were that you were just aggressive and so on and so forth. And you did, in your response, you did take responsibility for the fact that, yeah, sometimes I'm an intense guy. But in terms of most of the accusations, you're saying it's BS. Is that right?
It was grossly exaggerated by JRI, and it was really it's really a hostile takeover. And my entire
What do you think their motivations are? I don't.
I think what has happened is that the guy who runs JRI was embarrassed about letting something bad that my executive director was doing going on for too long, and he tried to shove the responsibility for himself onto
when you say
me.
Something bad, what was the bad thing that was?
And I don't want to go into that because
okay.
I don't exactly know what the allegations against him were. I've heard some details from my staff, but the head of JI certainly succeeded in devolving the attention away from that because it all went to me at this point. It's quite a bad thing, actually.
Yeah, it's got to be so intense to deal with that. And now you've got, it sounds like a lot of people have been rallying around you in support. And I'm guessing most of your colleagues and people that work with you and know you closely. Yeah, that's great.
So if you want to know more about it, go on my website, besselvanderkolk.com, and you'll see what everybody in the trauma center and all of my colleagues and former students say about this.
Yeah, and we'll include that in the show notes, folks, if you want to go listen to that or read that article. It's a great response from Bessel himself. So, okay, cool. Well, I just thought we'd touch in on that just for a minute. And, speaking of trauma, I mean, that can be, when your character is really attacked, that can be bring up a lot emotionally for a person. I'm curious, just for you, how, as a teaching for other people, how do you deal with that?
Well, it really is a traumatic event. It's suddenly at my stage of life to have suddenly being confronted with character assassination. And boy, did I firsthand experience the critical things I always sort of abstractly have talked about. One is social support. Having people who believe you, having people who are there for you, having people who stick by you is unbelievably important. I couldn't imagine how I would have dealt with this without the outpouring of support from around the world, basically. So social support is really critical, and that, of course, becomes very relevant for couples who then oftentimes turn against each other. And how important it is to have people who see us, who know us, with whom we can share the truth is critical. The other piece that I always like to talk about, very important for me again right now, is the capacity for imagination. Like, how do I get out of here? What are the possibilities for the future? Being able to envision new possibilities is also terribly important. When you get traumatized, you feel like this will never come to an end. There's no new possibilities. So helping traumatized people to envision new realities is terribly important also.
Yeah, totally. And would you add to that meaning making, like making meaning of our circumstances? Do you think that's an important step in trauma recovery?
Well, yeah. I think I think it's important to know what you know and to find words for the experience. And I think you get words for the experience, i.e. meaning making, by having people with you who are patient enough with you to let you tell your story and to get new angles on things and to ask you tricky questions of where you try to deny some of your own reality. So having one or more people in your life who can really help you to understand what's going on and to also go to the places that you may want to avoid going to. I think a very important part of dealing with trauma is to open yourself up to the unpleasant realities that you don't want to face.
Like in your body, right? You talk a lot about, a lot of
Your
people don't want to
body,
go in their body because that's where the memory lives.
right? And things that you feel ashamed about, or things you'd rather forget, or the issue of self-blame, that I wasn't strong enough, I wasn't fast enough, I didn't think well enough, I didn't defend myself enough. And there's always big issues having to do with self-blame and feeling ashamed about yourself and then wanting to hide yourself.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Okay. Cool. I've got so many more questions. And we have a limited amount of time. So I want to start with this notion that early adverse childhood conditions, stress, abuse, neglect can predict outcomes in mental health and overall life performance into adulthood. And I want to zero in on that. In your book, you cited this guy, Robert Adna, who you mentioned that what he did with the ACEs study, for example, and he concluded that the biggest national health problem isn't obesity or heart disease, it's actually child abuse. If we look at all the symptoms that people get diagnosed with, if we look at them as symptoms of this underlying issue of maybe child abuse, it seems like that maybe is the biggest health crisis in the United States. Would you say more about that?
So it's emerging on many different levels. The ACE study and the work by Marty Teicher and Michael DeBellis and some of our work is that if you get abused and neglected as a child, it causes very serious damage to your capacity to regulate yourself, to pay attention, to concentrate, to trust, and to have a sense of self. And so early abuse, not being reflected, not being known, not being seen, not being responded to, has pervasive effects on people's immune system, their relationship to their bodies, their capacity to take care of themselves, the capacity to stay focused and to pay attention, and most of all, to filter out relevant from irrelevant information. A lot of these systems get very damaged by early childhood trauma. But I want to say the opposite also. And the opposite is also that early childhood trauma also predisposes people to find extraordinary solutions to unbelievable problems. So at the same time that early childhood trauma causes a lot of trauma, a lot of damage, it also can unleash astounding creative potential in people. My personal feeling is that the people who really move society forward are the people who have needed to see new solutions for old problems. And those are oftentimes people with histories of trauma, actually.
Yeah, well, how come some people like that, creative geniuses call it or whatever, that move the culture forward with these incredible, innovative things that they do, versus a person who gets stuck and ends up homeless and can't deal? Like, what's the difference there? Is there any studies on that?
I'm a little suspicious of that dichotomy. When I hear the details of what people I know have gone through in their lives, I am impressed with everybody in their own way for having found the best solution that they could find. And so I find everybody who I deal with in their own way quite interesting and creative. Some people happen to have lucked out and do something that also benefited other people. But this experience, I know lots of people who work in jails. I've never worked in a jail. And I know yoga teachers in jails and theater people in jails. And it's astounding with how much deep affection they talk about the people they work with. And that when you're in this controlled environment, they really get to know these very damaged and oftentimes very dangerous people, and they get to see how they have made adaptations to the particular horrors that they have needed to deal with.
Yeah.
And so what's intriguing to me is how everybody is resilient in their own rights,
Hmm.
and that I don't dichotomize people into non-resilient and resilient. Some of the resilient people I know, who you may have heard about, I know them as patients, and I know how incredibly damaged they are on some level of their life, while they get public kudos, while other people who are obscure and barely making it can do amazing creative things.
Yeah.
So you
Yeah,
should
that's
not
great. Good
judge
reminder.
this book by its cover, you know?
Yeah,
Um,
totally. And there really is a resiliency in the human spirit that's pretty amazing. How do we not
yeah.
see people as broken or traumatized or just as victims? Because so many the victims of trauma really it's easy to see that in people, and then people sort of judge and want to push away. How do we like treat them with more? I mean, is it just a mindset thing
Well,
of treating them with more care and
well,
understanding?
the best thing is to get in touch with your own trauma. You know,
Yeah.
I think a
Yeah.
lot of the lack of compassion for other people comes from a lack of compassion for your own wounded parts. And so, because you don't want to feel your own wounds and you don't want to feel your own pain,
Yeah.
but once you really feel the wounded parts of yourself and remember how wounded you have been and how strongly you have tried to dissociate yourself from these weak parts of yourself. Once you get in touch with them, I think you get more compassionate about other people's struggles also.
Yeah, I would agree with that. My capacity certainly has grown over the years. I used to, judge all emotional people, for example, and then I finally started feeling my emotions,
Right,
and then I
exactly.
had
There
more
you go.
understanding, right?
Right.
And okay, so this guy Folletti, is that his guy? He talked about the
Uh-huh.
ACEs study.
Vince Valetti. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to just talk about him for a minute as a kind of branching off this resiliency piece around a person who, let's say, gains weight after a trauma. He studies that and
Right.
how it's actually a solution to feel safe, for example. Can you
Yes.
just explain and unpack that for
No,
someone who
so
doesn't
the ACE
understand
study,
that?
yeah, the ACE study was this very large study of 17,773 people, largely college-educated white people in Kaiser Permanente, and they found this incredible degree of trauma that was pervasive in this regular sample of patients, medical patients. And then what he found, and the way he describes it is different from how I interpret it. What they found is that early childhood trauma leads to increase in drug addiction, increase in alcoholism, increase of all kind of medical illnesses, suicide attempts, smoking. But what I see, the way I interpret that whole study, is that early childhood trauma leads to a lack of respect for yourself and the integrity of your body. And so that once you feel neglected to superfluous, unnecessary, and despicable in a way, you start treating yourself as an unnecessary and despicable person.
Hmm.
And so these early adverse childhood experiences get translated into a lack of deep respect for your, what I like to call your organism, making
Hmm.
sure that your body is okay, loving yourself and loving your body, because once you feel despicable, you treat your body as if it's despicable.
Yeah, and then if someone from an outsider might look at an obese person and say, "You need to get on a weight loss program," and blah blah blah, and they've tried those, right? And if there's an underlying trauma, which is what the study was about, it seems like, oh, actually, there's a more effective way to deal
Right.
here.
So that's where Philadelphia study started. I also had an experience of I I was the expert witness of a woman who, when I got her charge, she said she weighs 300 odd pounds. And I thought, how am I going to interview her in my office? I don't have a single chair that can contain a person like that. And she walks into my office, and here's this svelte woman. And I say, here, I have your old chart, and you weigh 325 pounds, and here you come in and you look perfectly fine. And she says, yes, once I dealt with my trauma, and once I acknowledged the fact that my cousin had been seriously sexually abusing me, I was able to liberate myself from having to protect myself against him because I now knew my truth.
Yeah, so powerful. And are you
Yeah,
saying, just to be clear, if we use a weight loss example, we could use any addiction, for example, but if we stick
yeah,
to weight loss, someone gains weight as a way to protect themselves, right? That's one strategy,
yeah,
right? Is so
yeah.
if I
So,
get bullied on the playground, I might get
uh,
really big as a way to protect myself.
right. So Valetti says is overlooked is uh, overweight is overlooked. And so a lot of the things that mental health professionals tries to exterminate and fix, in fact, are have their origin as solutions to very complex problems.
Yeah. Now, you've worked very hard, it seems to me, on trying to get a diagnosis for trauma in the DSM. And the
Right.
American Psychological Association has basically denied it in the
American
DSM-5, right?
Psychiatric Association.
Okay,
Yeah.
American Psychiatric Association.
Yeah. God knows what will happen to this. We have been trying since we got a diagnosis of PTSD in there in 1980. A group of us have been consistently working on getting another diagnosis in the DSM that really captures the long-term consequences of childhood trauma. And
Yeah.
why it has been such an uphill battle beats me. In the last DSM-5, we submitted very detailed data on 20,000 people in various stages of development, gave very, very good statistical analyses about how the combination of trauma and early neglect or disturbed attachment relationship led to very clear, consistent consequences. And somehow they don't want to buy it. And they say, oh, this is just clinical intuition and not research-based facts. Well, in fact, we have so much data that show the correlations.
Yeah. I mean, I guess you've thought about this. Like, why do you think that is? Like, is this a money thing in the pharmaceutical industries, or what's going on here? If you had
Uh,
to guess.
yeah, I'm not the right person to talk about it because I'm so puzzled, and that's why I'm still maybe stupid enough to continue with this. I don't understand why people don't want to acknowledge those data. So you really should ask the American Psychiatric Association why they keep ignoring the reality of people's lives.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's personally, I mean, mind-boggling, really. And you've talked about in your book how a lot of how trauma gets dealt with is medication, right? Which can you talk
Yeah.
about why medication is not a great solution for trauma? Like if we're talking about,
Well,
benzos or, whatever the medication is,
right.
really.
Well, why it doesn't work? Other than that, it's great. Like,
Yeah.
I started off life as a psychopharmacologist, and I was as excited as anybody that we'd find drugs to reset the organism and that people would get better and have a better life through chemistry. And it didn't work. I did the early studies on Prozac, the very first study on Prozac, very first study on Zoloft, and the results they were not terrible, but they certainly did not cure people by any means. It just relieved the pain to a minor degree. What is upsetting to me at this point is that while there certainly is a role for psychiatric medications to alleviate some of the pain, it became the entire focus of treatment. And
Alleviate the
what
pain.
what is very clear is that if you're traumatized, you need to deal with the trauma.
Yeah.
You cannot just push it away by taking drugs.
And how do people deal with the trauma if they're in denial about the trauma in the first place? If they're like, my childhood was
Well,
fine.
uh, no, as long as people are in denial of the trauma, they're not fine. The trauma shows up in
I'm with you,
anger
but
outbursts and shutting down and not taking pleasure in anything and making other people angry. And no, it shows up because all that stuff sits inside of you. And as long as it sits in your body will regularly react as if you are in danger.
yeah.
And so then the natural human tendency is to say, it's all your fault because you didn't do the dishes, or it's all your fault because you were 5 minutes late for an appointment. And that's why I'm so enraged with you. And in fact, it's actually, you're just 5 minutes late, and I'm enraged. And that's my problem. I'm enraged about you being 5 minutes late.
Right.
And so as long as you put it on other people, you don't take responsibility yourself. And usually people don't really find treatment until too many things have gone wrong. and they need to take a hard look at themselves to see what they have contributed to things having gone wrong in their lives.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Okay. You've been a psychiatrist for how long?
44 years.
Wow. Okay, so it's a pretty credible source here.
Yeah.
When you talk about medication, for example, in your book, you made a point somewhere in there that you said, when people get traumatized, they eventually it's a problem of dysregulation is one of the things, and they're trying to regulate. And one of the ways they regulate is to seek, in a way, an external regulator like some kind of medication, whether it's self-soothing behaviors, masturbation, or biting one's hand, or and then eventually it turns into adult addictions, let's say alcohol or cannabis or
Oftentimes, yeah.
yeah.
The one of the, yeah.
And is there any real like you made the comparison, I think, if I read it right, that those drugs, is there any real difference than those drugs than, say, pharmaceutical drugs in terms of trying to make your trauma go away, so to speak?
They're all chemicals,
Right.
when you get it from your doctor, you're probably a little bit more clear about what dosage you're getting than from your drug dealer in the street. And there's strictures about it, so I don't want to completely equate them. But the final common pathway is that, yes, you take drugs in order to blunt your feelings. Yeah.
Yeah. And is there a way, you as a psychiatrist for 44 years, you're not ruling out medication entirely, or are you?
No.
Because because sometimes it's what a person needs to be able to get to the trauma. Would you say that's true?
No, I don't find that to be generally true. But in order to get to deal with the trauma, you need to be calm enough to observe your pain. And so when you're really in the middle of your trauma, your capacity to observe and to notice and to bear what's going on with you probably doesn't exist. And so we have been looking for a variety of different ways that makes it possible for people to begin to tolerate their feelings. And that got us into studying yoga. And so what we discovered is that regular yoga practice looks like it's more effective than any medication that certainly I have ever studied.
Yeah.
And I believe that methods like Qigong, Tai Chi, these oriental methods of calming yourself down and getting into a rhythm may be extraordinarily helpful to make your mind beginning to be capable of tolerating the anger you feel inside of yourself, or the pain, or the revenge feelings, etc., etc. But you need to make a person capable of observing themselves. So the other thing that I'm in the middle of exploring very deeply is something called neurofeedback, where you can basically play computer games with your own brainwaves and slowly shape your brainwaves in a way that they're more focused, again, pay better attention and become more flexible in your mind.
Yeah.
But I think in generally, the mistake that many people make is that they want to rush into the trauma before a person's mind is ready to tolerate all the pain and misery that the trauma entailed.
Are you saying you need to get a person ready to deal with the trauma, basically?
Absolutely. You need to really prepare a person to become still, to be mindful, and to learn to observe themselves with compassion.
Yeah. Yeah, you talk about in the book that to gain access, the only way you can gain access to the emotional brain, which is part of healing trauma, is through self-awareness, some kind of self-awareness practice, right?
Yeah. And actually, we know the pathways, the neural circuits of that self-observing very well these days. And we know a lot about what gets damaged in the brain, actually, and what circuits you need to activate and nourish in order to become in charge of yourself again. Yeah.
Yeah. It seems like some of your treatments that I read through the book that you recommend, like yoga, Qigong, let's say meditation, are very much a self-awareness or a self process, like just me and myself. I don't need another person to do it. You also mentioned relationship work, like therapy.
Either, because if you have a Qigong or yoga practice, you know how much more satisfying is to do it with other people than doing it by yourself. That's a very
Okay.
intriguing part about these body practices, how much more satisfying they are when you do them together with other people.
Yeah.
Why that
Yeah. I mean,
is,
that's true
we
for
don't
me.
quite know
Yeah.
yet. Yeah.
And you don't
Um,
mention, you don't go into, at least as far as I read most of the book, you don't go into many, many chapters on why relationships, like healing relationships, are so important. Why is
you
that?
think I don't go into that?
Yeah, like
I
not
thought I
not
had like four
specifically.
chapters. I
What's
thought I had
that?
four chapters. I thought I had four chapters on that. Um,
Well, I
in
think
that,
you're doing it
but,
in a context of like the healing
oh,
relationship. Yes.
oh, absolutely. No,
But
no.
what
The
about like
whole thing is
friendships and like a marriage and safe relationships like that?
we are relational creatures.
Totally.
I mean, we're deeply, everything about our brain is about being in relationship. I mean, our diagnostic system completely ignores that. We are creatures that from the moment we are born or the moment we're conceived are in relationship to other people. And so we are completely embedded in relationships. You have to be pretty bizarre to want to live all by yourself on a ranch and
Right.
never be in a relationship with other people. I mean, every form of mental illness is expressed in a disruption of relationships.
But that's not
That's
acknowledged in the DSM, right?
no, that's but
That's
we
absurd, right?
don't exist as individuals. We only exist because we are part of other tribes, other groups of people, and neighborhoods and religions and all that sort of stuff. That's who we are. That's what our brains are all about. And so it's these relationships that get disturbed by trauma, where you feel alienated and scared of other people. And so the treatment of trauma is really uh, building bridges, repairing relationships, feeling safe with other people, and being able to have your bodies next to other bodies, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm with you. How can
Yeah.
you, with the DSM, how does a model that's like that, a book like that's almost 600 pages long, not acknowledge that, be at all valid? Like, why is it still a valid,
Who
why
says it's valid? I never
all
said
the
that.
all I know you didn't say it, but the thousands of people that are using it every day to diagnose and treat people,
Well,
it's still taught that largely
but
that's still the model.
I was part of the original DSM, and so we put it together. And what we said in the preamble of the DSM is this is just a list of symptoms. These are not real diagnoses like oat cell carcinoma of the lung or bile duct obstruction. It comes to the medical world. This is not at all real diagnosis. It's just a list of symptoms. And it's so inaccurate that it should never be used for forensic purposes or for insurance reimbursements.
Yeah.
And that little preamble disappeared in later editions of DSM, but that preamble was the correct preamble. Psychiatric diagnoses are not in any way like medical diagnoses. They're just invalid attempts to sort of create artificial categories that may or may not be relevant to human existence.
Yeah. It's intense, right? Anyway, it's very refreshing to read your book because of your
Yeah.
deep experience inside the system and also your willingness to look outside of it. A couple more
Well,
questions.
necessity. Okay, okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, and you, okay, so here's an interesting question that comes up for me a lot with people is why do people who have been abused as kids continue to find themselves in circumstances where abuse happens later on? What's your, experience with
Oh
this?
boy.
What's the
That,
explanation of that?
that is the no, that's the $64,000 question in our field. Is how do we get to repeat our old patterns?
Exactly.
How do our brains get set for what's familiar over what's safe? And so when we are in unfamiliar surroundings, we don't feel like we are ourselves. And uh, when we are back to what people were like when we were growing up, you go like, "Oh, I'm at home." So if you're
Right. I
really
know
in a
that.
very nice, quiet, gentle, thoughtful community, but you grew up with a lot of explosive anger, you go like, "No, I don't like these Swedish type people. I rather hang out with a bunch of Sicilians who are more expressive. And
Yeah.
so we really get geared towards being with the sort of stimulation that we were with as young kids to a large degree. Um, and so, I see this used to see this in soldiers, that they would feel nothing as long as there was no danger. But the moment they're in a dangerous situation, they start feeling
They feel
alive
alive.
again. So
Yeah.
they become firefighters, and they become bungee jumpers, and they become motorcycle riders because they're always living on the edge of danger, because the rest of the time they don't feel anything. I've seen it with many women who were molested and abused as kids, is that they start dating guys who are gentle with them and thoughtful with them, and they find them boring beyond belief. And there was a guy who is an alcoholic and is dangerous and unpredictable, and they go like, oh, let me save this person, because now I'm
Yeah.
at home and I try to save my daddy also. And then after the first big failure, they date other people and dull, and they meet another guy who is dangerous, and they suddenly start feeling excited again.
Yeah.
So these are very complex issues in human nature, is that there is something about our biology that drives us back to what's familiar and not necessarily what's safe.
Yeah. Would you say, what do you think about recapitulation? That the idea that we recapitulate an early memory or an experience as a way to heal it, as a way to try to work through the original injury?
Yeah, that's what Freud said. I think he was completely wrong about it, actually.
Really?
Because,
Well,
yeah, because no, you don't get better from marrying your fifth alcoholic husband. You
right, but it
just
keeps happening.
keeps happening because you are fulfilling that compulsion to go back to what's familiar. And so the challenge to actually open up your heart, your mind, your body to new things is the great challenge, actually. But you
Yeah.
don't
Oh, yeah.
you don't get it from doing the same old, same old.
I'm with you, but some people, the same old is what motivates them to change and go, I got to stop doing this thing.
No, it's
Right? They get burnt out on the pattern.
when they actually get hurt once too often. They
Yeah.
say, I have to reform myself and reorganize myself, but you don't do that by going in the same old damn situation again.
Right. But I'm just
That's
saying
marrying
that.
another alcoholic.
Yeah. Right. But it just,
Yeah.
but because it happens, it's like, I like to ask the question, this is so interesting that people time in and time again find themselves back in their recreating their childhood home. Yes, because of familiarity, but perhaps also because they're tired of the pattern. This is pushing them further into the pattern as a way to like transform it.
No, I don't see it that way. I see it
Okay. Fair
as a
enough.
as a compulsion to repeat, which is the original term for it. It's a compulsion, in the same way that people have to check their gas stove 5 times, even though the last time they realized the gas stove was fine.
Yeah.
It's an unhealthy piece of human existence.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. In terms of for the therapists that are listening, that in sort of the trauma world, there's this concept of not getting a person to retell their story too many times because it further embeds the story in the brain, and then we have myelination around that. Is there danger in continuing to retell the story? And what, is that the power of the body-based practices as we cut below the dialogue and the narrative? Can you say something
Oh yeah,
about the retelling a
yeah,
story
yeah.
part?
I think a lot of people get stuck in their narrative. And I'm very much into that people get an identity. So sometimes when they run a workshop, uh, I ask people to, let's say, if you're on a dating site and you're looking for your ideal partner, what would you say to find your soulmate? And some people say, I would say that I'm an incest victim. And I think, that's probably not the ideal way of finding your soulmate. But people are so stuck in their identity of this terrible thing happened to me that they cannot really get out of that identity of a victim of something terrible. And so the question is, how do you help people to change their identity from I'm a victim to, yes, that's one of the things that I've survived, but let me tell you what other things I have survived. And so there's
Yeah.
something very exciting about telling the trauma story over and over again, but that doesn't help you to recover.
Yeah.
In order to recover, you really have to have new experiences that are different.
So for new therapists or coaches or practitioners out there, is there kind of a word of warning or word of caution you would say? Because they're eager to hear the person's story, right? Tell me your story. Tell me about how you were hit as a kid. Like,
Yeah.
what could we tell them instead of doing that?
I tell them the same thing that one of my teachers once told me. And he said, Bessel, learn to keep your voyeuristic tendencies on hold.
Hmm.
So a lot of therapy may turn into voyeurism of hearing other people's stories. But that's not what the job of the therapist is. The job of the therapist is to allow people to meet themselves and to allow the past to be experienced as a thing belonging to the past.
Yeah, that's big. That's great. Okay. And all right. Yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. Nice. Would you, one more question here, Bessel, before I let you go. I've started this company called the Relationship School, and I'm on a mission to reach young people with the education we never got in school about how important relationships are to our health and our well-being in life. And
Yeah.
and especially, partnership and how to do that well, because it seems to be partnership, long-term relationship is one of the hardest relationships to do well. We get
Mm-hmm.
really bound up there. And
Yeah.
if I had 1,000 teens or young adults, and I could say one thing to them about relationships, like one teaching, and you were whispering in my ear, what would you have me tell them?
Oh, I wouldn't say anything. I would,
Okay.
the things that form relationships, see, are all the things that get abolished if you go to a poor public school. They abolish all the things that are helpful to kids. Playing together, doing athletics together, making music together, doing theater together, doing common projects together. That should be the core of every school system, is to celebrate the human capacity to collaborate and to make common projects together. I wouldn't say anything.
Yeah,
I would
you would
just
redesign the
do it.
school system.
I do it. You do it. Like
Yeah.
when we do workshops, we spend the first day basically doing stuff together and
Yeah.
getting to know each other on a rhythmical basis. I'm a very non-cognitive person. I don't believe that talking makes a great deal of difference, actually.
Okay, got it. Make them connect with each other and do a project together, basically.
Yeah, on a very, very rhythmical, physical basis. Sing together, make music together, create theater pieces together, build
Yeah.
structures together. Very, very physical, organic, body oriented engagement.
I'm so with you. It's a
Yeah,
breath of
yeah.
fresh air to hear that. I mean, to me, the translation there is redesign the school system. That's what I'm getting.
Well, it's interesting when you go to nice private schools, they do all that stuff.
Right. They do a lot
That's
more
why
of it.
people pay that extra money, so your kid actually gets to play and do theater and do stuff. And once you get this feeling of connection and healthy competition and collaboration, then kids learn. I mean, you don't have to do all these exams to make sure that they stay up to date, because we are natural learners. And when we feel connected with our environment, we want to learn.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Cool. Well, Bessel, thanks. I want to respect your time here. Really
Okay?
appreciate it. And can you tell people where to find you?
So the best way to find me these days is through www.besselvendelkolk.com. And because our website got hijacked, and we'll have a new website is being created right now. It's called BostonTraumaCenter.com.
Great.
But it starts with my personal website right now.
Okay. Well, I'm so glad you're forging
Okay.
onward, and with
Oh,
the
absolutely.
deeply important work you've done for us in the
Okay.
world around trauma. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Bye
Yeah.
bye.
Okay. See ya. All right, guys. I hope I'm drilling it home for you here that your past will predict your relationship future and probably the future of your health and wellness. So whatever you went through as a kid, if you don't deal with it, it adds up and creates problems for you in your life. And this is not a reason to blame anyone in your past. It's an opportunity for you to use what you've been through to get stronger. So here's your action step from the Bessel van der Kolk interview is write down your biggest repeating pattern that's painful to you. I guarantee you, I almost guarantee you, I'll say that just to be safe, that it's caused from some kind of, quote, trauma from your history. Repeating patterns do that. Like he said, we disagree here a little bit, where I agree and I would say and, whereas Bessel is saying, no, because he's a scientist, right? There's no evidence that we attract and draw into our lives repeating patterns as a way to recapitulate, as a way to heal it. I get it. There's no science on that, but that's just my experience, so I'm saying it. He's saying we do it because of familiarity, right? It's familiar. We go toward what's comfortable and familiar. So if we were beaten as a kid, we're going to be an adult who that's what we know. A peaceful environment is going to not feel right to us, and we're going to go more towards a chaotic environment where we might get hit again or hurt again in that way, in a violent, aggressive way. And anyone you talk to that works with human beings for more than 10 years sees these patterns show up. And he's got one explanation, and I agree with that. There's a familiarity. I'm with that. And I would add on, we draw this stuff into our lives. In my opinion, the universe is on our side in a way to get us to heal, to get us to grow, and to get us to become who we are. Right? This is a stretch for some people. They don't want to buy that. It's too woo-woo or something. That's fine. I don't care if you buy it or not. It's just my experience. So here's your action step. Write down your most painful pattern, and then right next to that, write what you're going to do about it. Okay, and if you take the trauma lens, there's a number of different practitioners out there that can help you. There's neurofeedback, there's yoga, there's SE therapy, there's SPI therapy. You could do some work with a level 2 relationship coach here at the relationship school. There's a number of different ways that you can get assistance with your repeating pattern. So what's the action step? And the last part is be seen. Stop being alone and share your painful pattern with at least one person in your life and say, I think I have a painful pattern. And here's what I want to do about it. Here's what I'm going to do about it. Okay? Nice. Excellent. Now, if you want help and you're into the conversation, let's say you're a therapist, a coach, some practitioner out there, and you're interested and intrigued about my take on trauma and how to work with, quote, trauma, then go to jasongaddis.com/coaches. And I'm going to give you 3 advanced techniques that are going to address any relationship problem in half the time. And I've worked with a lot of trauma in my life, in myself as a client, as well as with other people. And I've done plenty of trauma training. So I feel very experienced here in the human condition. And it matters to me that you work through your traumatic experiences as a kid because, as Dan Siegel says, the brain is plastic and you can heal and create wellness out of any, quote, disease or any experience. And we'll talk about that in the podcast episode with Dan Siegel. So stay tuned for that coming up. You're going to get real science about it because he's a scientist, basically. And I'm not. So that's why I back myself up with scientists who do research on this. Okay, I'm psyched that you and I got to spend time with Bessel van der Kolk. And, whatever you think of the news about him in the Boston Globe article is what you think about him. But no one can deny the impact this man has had on the field of trauma, psychiatry, and psychotherapy. Okay, truly a trailblazer trying to help label people in a way that gets them accurate help. Right? The ridiculousness of how we currently label people with psychiatric or psychological disorders is pathetic at best. And we can do better. And Bessel van der Kolk is saying that because so many of these, quote, disorders are from trauma. And that doesn't get acknowledged, nor does relationship in the DSM. It's bullshit. So be one of the people that, is holding up a light in this nonsense system and start to make the kind of change you see, especially you therapist types, all right? You healer helper types, you coaches. Come on, guys, we can move this whole conversation forward, all right, by working with people in a smarter, more intelligent way and getting accurate an understanding of what they're going through and not medicating them. It's just nonsense. Okay. Woo. All right. Enough already, Jayson. Okay. I'm psyched that we got time today. And thanks for being with me. We'll talk soon.